Good morning. Welcome to this commencement conversation at Stillman College. We are delighted that you all are joining us this morning. We are excited about this conversation as we discuss Christian leadership and social justice. We recognize, of course, our inspiring and untiring president, Dr. Cynthia Warwick. She is the 7th president of Stillman College and the first woman to hold that position. This was her initiative as she guides us and leads us to consider some curricular changes with the religion and theology major, and as we consider creating a particular emphasis in that major. So we recognize, again, our president, Dr. Cynthia Warwick. I'm grateful for the leadership and help of the vice president for academic affairs, Dr. Mark McCormick, as he also works with our religion and theology department as we consider how to implement some of these ideas that we'll discuss today into the college's curriculum. We have a wonderful group of people to lead us in this discussion this morning. First, we have Reverend Gregory Bentley. He is the pastor of Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Huntsville, Alabama. He's also the co-moderator of the 224th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. We in the Presbyterian Church have a national meeting every 2 years, and so he is one of the co-leaders of our denomination during this 2-year period, and he is already implementing and initiating very important conversations and getting us on a road to justice in our ministry in the Presbyterian Church. Our panelists include wonderful individuals who know Christian ministry very well and especially understand the importance of social justice in Christian ministry. First of all, we have the Reverend Dr. Tyshawn Gardner, who is the pastor of Plum Road Baptist Church and the vice president for student affairs at Stillman College. We also have Reverend Eva Melton, who is the founder and pastor of the Firm Foundation Church in Birmingham. She's an author and a life coach. We also have Reverend Melvin Owens. He is the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Lafayette, depending on your pronunciation there, in Lafayette, Alabama. And he's the president of the Alabama State Missionary Baptist Association. And we have Reverend Lakeisha Womack. She is the founder of Womack Consulting. She has also created a wonderful platform and conference called Rethinking Church. She had the inaugural event last year and she has planned and will present a second one this year in the month of June. We are delighted again to have these people with us, to have these wonderful minds and wonderful servants of God and God's people. We are thankful again for the college and this opportunity. If you don't know, check the college's website and feel free to join us tomorrow for commencement at 9 a.m. We have the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, who will be our commencement speaker. So please join us. It will be live streamed. You can find that at the college's website, stillman.edu. Now I will turn things over to Reverend Gregory Bentley. He is our keynote speaker. He will speak and address these issues and set the table for us. And then all of us will come back and we will hear from our panelists and then have an exciting conversation about these important issues. Reverend Bentley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Scribner. To President Warwick, the Board of Trustees, faculty, staff, students, this August panel, the alumni of Stillman and all who have joined us in this virtual space. I greet you in the strong and sufficient name of Jesus, who is the Christ. It is always a joy to come home, to be in a space and a place that has meant so much to me and my family. Stillman has indeed been a bridge over troubled waters for me and my families and many others. So it's a blessing, and I'm grateful to be in this space. Dr. Scribner, I'm reminded of a story as we gather for this important conversation that was told by the Greek orator Demosthenes. Demosthenes was once speaking on life and death and matters of eternity, and he was speaking and weighing in on these matters, and the people were just tuning out. They were talking, leaving the room, just not paying attention. So Demosthenes stopped in the middle of his talk, talking about life and death and matters of eternity. And he said, I want to tell you a story. There was a man who had a bundle of wood, and he came to this mountain, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to carry the bundle of wood over the mountain. So he saw this man with a donkey, and he said, I'll ask this man, can I rent his donkey to carry my bundle of wood over the mountain? So he asked the man, and the man agreed. So he rented the man's donkey, and they set out to go across the mountain. About midday, when the sun was at its zenith, they stopped to take a break. And the man whose donkey it was sat in the shade of the donkey. Now, there was only enough shade cast by the donkey for one man to sit in it. So as the man who owned the donkey sat in the shade of the donkey, the man who rented the donkey said, hey, I rented that donkey. That's my shade. And the man who owned the donkey said, oh, no, you rented the donkey, not the shade of the donkey. The shade is mine. And they went back and forth. And then Demosthenes stopped midstream. And then the people said, oh, tell us, what happened? Whose shade was it? Who owned the shade of the donkey? And Demosthenes says, now see, I was talking to you about matters of life and death and eternity, but you would rather hear about the shade of a jackass. So thank you, Brother Scribner, for inviting us to have a conversation about something a little more important than the shade of a jackass. With that being said, let's get to it. Christian leadership and social justice. It is my task this morning to show the organic relationship between the gospel of Jesus Christ and justice. The fact that such a conversation is even warranted bears witness to the troubling state of affairs in the institutional church. When we survey church history, almost every 500 years, fault lines, fractures, and fissures occur that cause the body of Christ to have to do some deep soul searching. In the 4th century of the Common Era, Christianity was adopted as the official state religion by the Roman Emperor Constantine. Around 1000 CE, the church split into two branches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Then on October 31st, 1517, a Catholic priest named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to stop the sale of indulgences, what Luther called get out of hell free cards, to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. This ignited the Protestant Reformation and brought into existence a third major branch of the Christian church. I believe that we are living in such a convulsive and seismic moment right now, so much so that many people have remarked that the church is indeed dying. Although the church is facing serious challenges and controversies, enormous stresses and strains, tremendous trials and tribulations, I categorically reject that the church is dying. Indeed, and instead, I agree with the view of the Reverend Dr. Emily Towns, Dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University, that the church isn't dying, it's being transformed. Now, transformation can be very unpleasant, even downright excruciatingly painful. But if we stay the course, we can emerge on the other side as a new creation with a new understanding and a new perspective. To help us traverse this treacherous terrain, I will begin with the relevant terms of our conference title. In so doing, I want to be descriptive and not definitive, expressive and not exhaustive. What do we mean when we say the word Christian? Simply put, Christian means Christ-like. The first Christians were Jews who were followers of Jesus of Nazareth, who were first called Christians at Antioch, the account of which is found in Acts chapter 11, verse 26. Christians originally called themselves followers of the way, disciples or saints. But over time, the name Christian stuck and is now used universally to refer to members of the body of Christ, the church. Next, we look at leadership. Leadership is the act and art of causing an individual or group of individuals to go in a certain direction to a particular place. As such, leadership requires directionality, intentionality, and clarity of purpose. In other words, leadership concerns itself with three questions. Where are we going? Why are we going there? And how do we get there? At this point, I want to make a distinction between what I call colonized leadership and emergent leadership. What is the difference? Well, I'm glad you asked. Colonized leadership is imposed by people and forces outside the community that are almost always hostile and harmful to the flourishing and well being of the community. This type of leadership is more about power than it is about purpose, more about control than it is about setting the captives free, more about labeling than it is about liberation. Conversely, emergent leadership is not imposed or forced on the community, but comes out of the community itself. It is leadership by and for the flourishing, well being, and uplifting of the community. Acts 6, 1 through 7 gives a good example of this type of leadership. In this powerful and pregnant passage, we are told that Greek speaking widows in the church at Jerusalem brought a complaint to the apostles that they were being neglected in the ministry of food distribution. The 12 apostles then gathered the whole community and told them to select 7 men from among themselves who were full of the Spirit, full of wisdom, and in good standing. A few things are noteworthy here. The apostles did not select the leadership for them. They gave the people some principles of discernment to select their own leadership. Second, leadership isn't invested in a single person, but in a group of persons, a spiritual community. This is deep spiritual wisdom because God speaks to and through the whole church and not to just a few select people who hold a position or title. The third term I want to describe is justice. The American legal system is at best a system of retribution and vengeance. And unfortunately, that is needed because without the threat of consequences and penalties for wrongdoing, if there were no punitive measures to serve as a deterrent, things would probably be much worse than they are. But this is not the biblical notion of justice. The biblical notion of justice, especially in the 3 major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, isn't punitive, retributive, or vengeful. It is distributive and restorative. What does this mean? It means that justice is about ensuring that each and every person has access to what they need to flourish and live into the fullness of who God created them to be. I like how Dr. Cornel West puts it. Justice is love in the public square. Some of my Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC mentors, put it this way. Justice is love with overalls and work boots on. A few biblical passages on justice. Micah 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Isaiah 1, verse 17. Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Psalm 82, verse 3. Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Amos 5:24, that verse that we are used to hearing on the lips of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And our Lord Jesus Christ made justice the meat of his mission in Luke 4, verses 18 and 19, which draws heavily from Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. When we survey the three parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, they are chock full of references to doing justice. And many of the New Testament writings place no less an emphasis on doing justice, particularly the Gospels. Just to name a few, Matthew 7, verse 12, the golden rule: in everything do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets. Matthew 12, verse 18, here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. Matthew 23, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. James 1, verse 27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So, in light of the fact that the Bible is full of references to doing justice, how did doing justice become separated from the gospel message? One reason has to do with how we interpret two important words: Zedek in the Hebrew Bible and Dikaiosune in the New Testament. Both words can mean righteousness or justice. However, far too often we have lifted up purity over justice, personal piety over public morality, personal responsibility over public policy. Don't get me wrong. Individual character counts. It does indeed count. It matters that we live the life we sing about in our song, that our walk matches our talk, that our practice matches our principles, that our deeds match our words. If you don't drink, smoke, gamble, do drugs, fornicate, or any of the things traditionally associated with being pious, that's all well and good. Keep on keeping on. But this is not primarily what biblical justice is about. Biblical justice is about right relationships, about how we treat one another, especially in the public square, and especially the most vulnerable among us. The false dichotomy between personal piety and public morality and public policy, I believe, comes from a lust for power and a desire to dominate. The South African theologian, pastor, and anti-apartheid activist, the Reverend Dr. Alan Bozak, contends that the Bible is a record of the resistance of God's people to domination and oppression. From Genesis to Revelation, there is some type of imperial presence looming in the background, be it Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, or Roman. The Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School, maintains that the Bible is the underground literature of a colonized and oppressed people. But sadly, in the Church of Jesus Christ, we all too often adopt imperial ways of thinking and behaving rather than the mind and message of Christ. This debilitating proclivity has erected three barriers that have ruptured the organic relationship between the gospel and justice: biblical literalism, fundamentalism, and white nationalism. Paul Tillich was once asked by a seminarian, with the seminarian holding up and shaking a Bible back and forth in his hand, "Dr. Tillich, do you believe this is the inerrant, infallible Word of God?" To which Dr. Tillich replied, "No, if you grab it. Yes, if it grabs you." Regrettably, far too often we have grabbed the Bible rather than the Bible having grabbed us. Listen to what the Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney has to say about biblical literalism. Biblical literalism requires reading all of the Bible as being intended to relay a series of historical and theological facts. This ignores what we know about language, that there are many kinds of speech and writing which we use in combination to make our points. irony, exaggeration, puns, sarcasm, riddles, proverbs, quotes in and out of context, etc. Insisting on biblical literalism flattens out the richness of the text and its multiple contributors. And even among Christians, there is no single Bible. There are different books in different sequence in Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and Anglican Bibles. Literal reading of non-literal texts can also lead to fraudulent readings, dogmatic tenacity to ahistorical or unscientific claims, and the loss of credibility for those who insist on nonsensical interpretations. Moreover, a literal reading of the creation account in Genesis 1 has been used to justify the ruthless exploitation, degradation, and destruction of the earth to the point of environmental collapse. The conquest narratives of the Bible, especially in the book of Joshua, have been used to justify genocide and imperialism. The second creation account found in Genesis 2 has been used to subjugate and silence women, as well as the household codes found in some of the New Testament epistles. And passages from Genesis, Leviticus, and various other New Testament epistles have been used to abuse, mistreat, discriminate against, and dehumanize same gender loving and other non-binary people. Isn't it interesting that even among people who regard the Bible as inerrant and infallible, they still pick and choose which passages to take literally and which ones to take figuratively and metaphorically? How is it that we see some biblical admonitions and directives as situational and others as eternal? Biblical literalism, quite frankly, can cause us to take positions and adopt attitudes and practices that are decidedly anti-Christian and do not reflect the heart and character of Christ. Biblical literalism is actually a salient feature of fundamentalism to which we now turn. The most serious problem that fundamentalism presents is a false sense of certainty about reality. It also tends to be very hostile to science. I always chuckle when I see somebody dismissing or demeaning science, having posted their sentiments to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or some other social media platform using an iPhone. The false sense of certainty that arises out of a particular reading of the Bible promotes obedience and compliance and shuns debate and inquiry. In a world that is rapidly changing, fundamentalism tends to focus on a familiar past, a golden period that we can return to if we would just be obedient and comply with how fundamentalists see the world and how it should operate. It's not hard to see how fundamentalism gives rise to authoritarianism and even nationalism. We see this playing out in the American context. Founded as a white settler nation on the twin evils of the genocide of the indigenous people of this land, as well as the theft of their land and the enslavement of Africans, white nationalism has been a constant feature of American society since its very inception. White nationalism creates a hierarchy of humanity, with white people at the top and everybody else beneath them. And the Bible was used to justify this evil arrangement using a corrupt reading of Genesis 9. White nationalism promotes the pernicious lie that Black people are cursed with black skin to forever be a subjugated and subservient class to white people. This type of misrepresentation and misreading of scripture helped to give rise to the doctrine of discovery, which was used by European monarchs to legitimize the theft and colonization of lands outside of Europe and manifest destiny. The belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the Americas was both justified and inevitable. Make no mistake about it, beloved. There is an intimate connection between biblical literalism, fundamentalism, and white nationalism. We saw it in Charlottesville with white men carrying tiki torches and shouting, "We will not be replaced." We saw it in the insurrection that took place in our nation's capital back in January. We saw it in the murder of our Asian sisters and brothers in Atlanta by a white terrorist. And we saw it in the murder of George Floyd by an unremorseful and unrepentant racist cop. So, what are we to do? Are we hopelessly locked into this death-dealing way of being in the world? To that, I answer with a resounding no. There is a way out and a way forward. In spite of the formidable barriers that ruptured the relationship between the gospel and social justice, I've stopped by today, beloved, to tell you this morning that there is a bridge that reconnects the organic relationship between the gospel and social justice. That bridge is the affirmation and adoption of the life and labor, the message and the mission of Jesus of Nazareth as the grounding and guiding principle for our faith and practice. I had a New Testament professor at ITC, Dr. Wayne Merritt, who would tell us seminarians from time to time to not just preach Jesus, but to preach what Jesus preached. But given the fact that our moral vision has been clouded by biblical literalism, fundamentalism, and white nationalism, we need some reliable guides to lead us in this undertaking. There are many, but a few come to mind. Dr. Gaylord Wilmore, author of Black Religion and Black Radicalism, he is a reliable guide. Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, author of The Politics of Jesus, he is a reliable guide. Dr. Will Gaffney, author of Womanist Midrash, she is a reliable guide. Dr. John Dominic Crowson, author of Jesus, a revolutionary biography, he is a reliable guide. Dr. William Herzog, author of The Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogue of the Oppressed, he is a reliable guide. Dr. Renita Weems, author of Listening to God, she is a reliable guide. Dr. Kane Hope Felder, author of Troubling Biblical Waters, he is a reliable guide. The whole religion department at Stillman, they are indeed reliable guides. And I want to be clear that academics are not the only reliable guides and interpreters. There is a legion of ordinary, everyday folks, full of folk wisdom and experts in folk theology, who have taught and who still teach us how to walk like Jesus walked, how to talk like Jesus talked, how to live like Jesus lived, and how to give like Jesus gave. They taught us that Jesus is Mary's baby, the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley, the bright morning star, bread for the hungry, a wheel in the middle of a wheel, and water in dry places. They taught us by precept and example, under the most dangerous and difficult circumstances, how to walk with the Lord. This is just a small sample of the people with the knowledge and the know-how to guide us in liberating biblical interpretation that empowers and equips us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Toward that end, I invite you to consider with me Exodus chapter 3. In that powerful pericope, we find the burning bush episode where God tells Moses to take off his shoes because he is standing on holy ground. God goes on to tell Moses that God is the God of his ancestors. Don't miss that. That's an important point. What I hear is that if we don't respect, know, and venerate our ancestors, we might not recognize the God who comes to us in our burning bush moments. A people who do not respect and venerate their own ancestors might just find themselves worshiping the gods of their oppressors, the gods of the people who hunted Harriet Tubman through the swamps of America, rather than the God who led her and many others to freedom land through those very same swamps. I'm talking about the Black prophetic tradition. It is a tradition that we need to be cognizant of, conversant with, and committed to. This tradition has birthed many witnesses. Nat Turner, he was a witness. Gabriel Prosser, he was a witness. Denmark Vesey, he was a witness. Harriet Tubman, she was a witness. Sojourner Truth, she was a witness. Richard Allen, he was a witness. Jarena Lee, she was a witness. Henry Howland Garnett, he was a witness. Ida B. Wells, she was a witness. Rosa Parks, she was a witness. Martin Luther King Jr., he was a witness. Ella Baker, she was a witness. Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a witness. This great cloud of witnesses who did not give in, who did not give out, and who did not give up. As we drink from this deep ancestral well, we will be filled and fortified with new power and new purpose to live into a fuller manifestation of the organic relationship between the gospel and justice. We are not just passive spectators in the symphony of life, but rather we are moral agents who have been called by God to shape the world in such a way that it reflects the heart and character of God. With that in mind, I close with these words from the 4th century North African bishop and church father, St. Augustine. Without God, man cannot. Without man, God will not. Peace and blessings. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation. God bless you.
Reverend Bentley, thank you so much. Thank you for that powerful presentation, for reminding us of how we got here, as well as what we need to do to address the shortcoming we often find in how we think about the gospel of Jesus Christ and how justice is inherently a part of it. Indeed, as we know so well, Jesus said in his first sermon, you might say in Luke chapter 4, that he had been anointed to preach the gospel to the poor, to take good news to the poor. And so often, somehow, a lot of preachers forget that aspect of Jesus's own first sermon. So again, Reverend Bentley, we thank you so much. We're grateful for your work there in Huntsville, as well as your work in the Presbyterian Church USA. And we're grateful for your time with us this morning.
Likewise, thank you.
Absolutely. As Mr. Tyler Davidson is bringing on our panelists, let me take a minute to recognize Mr. Tyler Davidson. He's working behind the scenes. He's behind the camera, behind the curtains, and he's making all of this happen for us today. So we're grateful for him in his work as Director of Development and Institutional Affairs at Stillman College. So thank you, Mr. Tyler Davidson. You all will see him out and about. You all thank him, and he makes all of this technology happen for us this morning. So we are grateful for him. Again, I am Joseph Scrivener. I am the pastor of Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church and the dean of chapel at Stillman College, and I am here to host and moderate this exciting conversation. Now that we've heard from Reverend Bentley, he's given us a feast from which to partake. Now I'll ask our panelists to give a brief response, and then after they respond, we will have a conversation among Reverend Bentley and the panelists. And as they are giving their response, and as we have Q&A among Reverend Bentley and the panelists, you can begin to formulate your own questions, and you can put your questions in the chat on whatever platform you're on, YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and we will do our best to pay attention to those and to incorporate those when we get to the point of taking questions and answers from our audience. So go ahead and think about those, write those down, or type those into the comment section in whatever platform you're on. Now we will hear from our panelists in alphabetical order. And so that means we'll hear first from Reverend Dr. Tyshawn Gardner. Again, Dr. Gardner is the pastor of Plum Grove Baptist Church and the vice president for student affairs at Stillman College. Dr. Gardner.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scrivener, for your gracious and very powerful narration and facilitation of this conference. I would be remiss if I did not first acknowledge and applaud our visionary president, Dr. Cynthia Warwick, for re-envisioning theological education in these troubled times and also providing a platform for public conversation. I think that's important. We don't want to miss that. So thank you so much, Dr. Warwick, for your contribution and your leadership. Thank you, Dr. Bentley. Your presentation was riveting, resounding, and as always, I am often enriched by your conversation and what you bring to the table, brother. So thank you so much. Now for my comments. Kelly Miller Smith, in his book, Social Crisis Preaching, said that social crisis preaching is the proclamation of that which is critically relevant within the context of the Christian gospel in times of upheaval and stress. And these are indeed times of upheaval and stress. I think the priority of the church today should be to lend an ear to what Dr. Warrick is putting before us. It calls for all of us being engaged. And that is ultimately to bring the message of Jesus and the prophets to bear on the social crisis in our communities, in our churches, in our cities and nations. The church should bear the brunt. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because the church should bear the brunt of this responsibility. Because historically, it was not the Muslims, but the Christian church that perpetrated the myth of race, upheld white supremacy from the cotton fields to the federal government, and excluded Black people through distorted truths of polygenesis, the curse of Ham, and sheer the brute force of violence. So the question, Dr. Scrivener, is not so much whether we do so, but how do we do it? The nuts and bolts of a revisited theology of liberation disseminated from the academy and the pews. We heard Dr. Bentley talk about folk wisdom, bringing Big Mama and Big Daddies and activists, young and old, to this conversation, to the local church. So the nuts and bolts is, how do we disseminate that from the academy and the pews to the local church, where this kind of prophetic activism is taught and played and lived out. So there are three reasons why I think it's very important. And some of these sort of overlap with what we just heard. But one is, we have been victims, and I say we, I mean primarily the Black and brown church, but in some real degree, the church as a whole. We have been victims of what I call an imbalanced hermeneutic. Imbalanced hermeneutic that's been heavy on personal piety, patriarchy, and theological principles, but very light on its contextualization in the lives of suffering people and matters of injustice. This is very important, because many of our pastors who have formal education have been spoon-fed the doctrines and theologies of conservative Western theologians. And often these doctrines, this teaching, have no relevance or practicality in the lives and lives of people of color. Also, this imbalanced hermeneutic often ignores the contributions of Africa to the Bible and to Christianity. It often dismisses the contributions of African Americans, Latin Americans, and others that what we have given to the church. If you would ask the average pastor, Black or white, but being a Black pastor is more fortunate, to name 5 Black theologians, they would be hard pressed. And if they can, it's usually one that's very conservative and a purveyor of white evangelicalism. This is a problem, and this is why we must revisit this conversation. It's a problem because the theologies and hermeneutics handed down to us doesn't allow or privilege the church to engage in political and social activism. For some of my white brothers and sisters and friends, the preacher, as citizen may appropriately participate creatively and constructively in social crisis situations, but as preacher, he's not expected to do so. Willie James Jennings said in his book, After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging, he says all theological education in the Western world is haunted by this illustration: a plantation at worship and an enslaved preacher. For centuries, Aubrey Hendricks, in his book, The Politics of Jesus, and Dr. Bentley again hit on this. For centuries, Dr. Hendricks says, Western biblical translators have softened the meaning of words and phrases they thought to be too challenging to the powers that be. So we grapple with this imbalanced hermeneutic and its implicability in our communities. But second, this conversation is vital and important because we must be about the business of preparing men and women who lead churches to become what Sally Brown calls agents of redemptive interruption. And pastors and preachers must disciple congregations, the people in the pews, to become agents of redemptive interruption. We need informed congregations around the matters that impact the lives of people in the pews, saying Jesus will make a way, often quoting, he will put bread on your table, clothes on your back. As true as that is, often it does not strike at the political, social, and economic matters that are plaguing our communities. And so, thirdly, and I end with this, another important reason why this conversation must be had and why I'm so glad we're having it is we need to hear the voices and see the vision of women. Just the other day, my wife and I had the privilege to watch a movie on Hulu. The movie was entitled The United States versus Billie Holiday. I urge you to see it. The movie is deep, it's painful, but what it said to me that often we overlook the contributions that women have played, not only in our churches, but for the advancement of Black and brown people. So when we revision this, what theological education looks like, just the sheer fact that we are having this conversation because a woman brought it to the fore, okay? And so when I look at that movie, Billie Holiday, here's a woman that was an activist. She was hunted and she was targeted by the FBI simply for her song, Strange Fruit. They forced her to the point of arrest and violence simply because she had a song that exposed the terror of lynching in America. Evelyn Higginbotham, in her classic book, Righteous Discontent, also places women at the fore and at their rightful place as activists in the church and the community. Phyllis Wheatley, before her, Black Lives Matter was started by 3 African-American women. And who can ignore the great and grand contributions of Stacey Abrams in Georgia? So this conversation needs to be revisited for the purpose of having our sisters alongside or in front of us leading the charge, and certainly rejecting and resisting any theology that seeks to silence women. Secondly, I'll say again, we must prepare pastors to prepare the people in the pews for social and civic activism, and we must relearn what social crisis theology and prophetic theology is really about, because we have been victims of this imbalanced theology or hermeneutic that has privileged whiteness and centered whiteness to the marginalization of everybody else. These are my comments. Again, thank you, Pastor Bentley.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Thank you so much for those 3 points, and we will most certainly be coming back to those. And again, I see some questions forming. You all please continue to think about and put your questions in the comment boxes, and we will get to those in due course in our conversation this morning. Thank you again, Dr. Gardner. Now we'll hear from Reverend Eva Melton. Again, she is the founder and pastor of The Firm Foundation Church in Birmingham. She's also an author and a life coach. So if you want some guidance in which direction your life is going, you want some help in finding your breadcrumbs, contact Reverend Eva Melton. Reverend Melton, go ahead. The floor is yours for your response.
Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here and just want to send a thank you to Reverend Bentley for an awesome message, and to Reverend Dr. Tyshawn Gardner, who came before me. Just great nuggets of wisdom and strategies around how we can move this thing forward. But I want to talk a little bit about, piggyback on Reverend Bentley's challenging how we view and interpret the text. And so we must understand how we interpret the text informs how we view worship and how we worship. And so I want to talk a little bit about worship as
Is that us or her?
Maybe her. Let's see. All right, here she comes.
ritual. We as clergy must continue.
Yeah, we got to get that sister back because I felt some smoke coming.
Okay, well, let's see. I'll text her and we'll get things squared away.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and transition to Reverend Melvin Owens. Again, Reverend Owens is the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Lafayette, Alabama. He's also the president of the Alabama State Missionary Baptist Association. Also, he served in a security capacity at Auburn University for many years and recently retired from that work. So we're grateful for his work as a pastor, as a leader of Baptists in our state, and his service at Auburn University for many years. Reverend Owens, the floor is yours, and we'll work Reverend Melton back into it when she's back online with us. Unmute yourself, Reverend Owens. There you
go. Captivated by what was about to occur with Reverend Melton that I neglected to even look at the screen. Thank you, Dr. Scrivener, to Dr. Bentley and Dr. Garner. All of the words that we've heard this morning provide a nucleus for spurring us to action. My comments are somewhat different in that it's born of a personal pathos. As a child of the 60s, I am intimately familiar with the arduous road traveled toward racial parity. As the only Black in my fourth grade class, I know firsthand the struggle that one is faced with when at the mercies of the larger society. Feelings of superiority that foster a need to ridicule and harass those you believe beneath you. Thankfully, much has improved since that interminably long semester at Eastside Elementary School. The second semester and subsequent years were much better, but the problem persisted. Grudgingly accepting me did not equate to gracious acceptance. And now with legitimate pride, we may note the many evidences of remarkable progress that has been made in the area of racial equality in the United States. Much is made of the historical election and re-election of an African-American president. And we point with pride to the presence of a woman of color elected to the vice presidency. And yet find ourselves at this moment facing the same old foes present before us, even though we claim many triumphs. This road we walk is littered with shrapnel from previous skirmishes and markers that suggest the fulfillment of ages-old promises and discover the battle yet rages. The reality of our failures is in achieving racial parity is constantly played out in the cities, towns, communities across the width and breadth of this nation. From Minneapolis to Brunswick, from New York to Louisville, from Charlottesville to DC to Atlanta, this seemingly endless loop continues. The reality is that this country has never done what has been needed to eradicate the root cause of these atrocities. We have allowed the roots to remain firmly entrenched in fertile soil. Slavery was abolished, but we substituted Jim Crow. We utilized mass incarceration, enacted laws to address issues, but are now engaged in systematically erasing those gains. As a matter of record, the reason we're still engaged in warfare against the same foe is that we are reluctant to uproot it so that it might die. We talk about 20 years of war in Afghanistan. That's not our longest running war. America's longest period of warfare is the struggle for possessing the promises made in our founding documents. The reason we still fight the fight of faith to thwart America's pattern of racial unrest is that we have refused to address the system of white supremacy, white nationalism. It was birthed and nurtures the darkness of the now. Direct and indirect forms of racism that promote white supremacy is evident in myriad ways in our housing policies and practices, in our policing engagements, especially in connection with people of color, in our assault on voting initiatives, and immigration enforcement. What spawns these actions and spurs these decisions, they're directly tied to white nationalism. Most appalling to me as I look at this phenomena is the conspicuous silence that emanates from the majority of the pulpits of the larger society. Seemingly, many pastors and leaders have developed laryngitis. And as Dr. Garner says quite eloquently, many of us are talking about pie in the sky and the Lord will make a way, but we have not digested that we are called to be way makers through the strength that he gives us. From my perspective, one disturbing truth is that many Christians has tacitly affirmed their condoning or either their wholehearted embrace of principles that perpetuate the behavior of separation. As Frederick Douglass told a London audience in 1846, the pulpit and the auctioneer's block stand in the same neighborhood. While the bloodstained gold goes to support the pulpit covers the infernal business with a garb of Christianity. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support missionaries, and babies sold to buy Bibles and communion services for the church. Robert Jones, who heads the Public Religion Research Institute, he outlines data that supports the notion that the more racist attitudes a person holds, the more likely he or she is to identify as a white Christian. The correlation is just as pronounced among white evangelical Protestants as it is among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. And sadly, the African-American church has joined in, has signed up to be co-conspirators. Yes. Jones' findings make for some wretched inferences. If you were recruiting for a white supremacist cause on a Sunday morning, you likely have more success hanging out in the parking lot of the average church than approaching them at other places of business. Until this nation confronts white supremacy and commits to demolishing it brick by brick, police brutality, vigilante violence, and rampant inequality will continue. And we have the answer. We have the antidote. Christ, as Dr. Scribner mentioned in Luke 4, he says there is a specific call to duty, that we're not called just to shout, but we're called to serve, that we're called to be light bearers and salt shakers in a world that's determined that's to go its own way. To have any hope of healing, we must acknowledge the fact that there is systemic racism in America. I heard Senator Tim Scott says that America is not racist. Well, maybe we ought to redefine what racism is, because from where I stand, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. We must admit our own ignorance, our own apathy, our own discomfort with people who are different from us, our own desire to believe that we're better than everyone else, our own willingness to take things that are not ours and keep things we did not earn. Our profound bent is to lie to ourselves about ourselves. Our willingness to do violence to get what we want, our willingness to turn away when violence is done to others because it benefits us. But today the church must stand. She must determine that she will follow the dictates of Christ. Christ was radical in his approach. He did not condone. He did not go along to get along. As Christians, we must forcefully, publicly name and repudiate these things. We must be honest about how long a history they have and how deep they go. We cannot continue to put Band-Aids on cancer and pretend that there is healing. There's much work we must do as believers to stand, to answer the call. Indeed, these moments that we've experienced over the last 18, 20 months should have been burning bush experiences, where we're called to acknowledge, first of all, that God sees, that God hears, and that God moves according to his will. And when God accosted Moses, Moses really thought that it was a good idea for liberation. He had no problem with someone being sent as an emissary to Egypt. The problem came about when the Lord says, and I will send you. And there are many of us who see the need, but we don't want to do the deed. And so I suggest to us as believers that the church can never divorce itself from social justice. It can never divest itself from the interests of its parishioners. We cannot stand on Sunday and talk about a God who will put bread on your table and be content with them relying on some theoretical abstract when we have bread in our hands. When in John 6, Jesus sees the crowd and has compassion on them, he asks a question. He says to them, where shall we buy bread enough to feed them? And of course, Philip suggested that, I've checked our inventory, our accounts, and we don't have enough money to feed this crowd. Andrew did took inventory, did the evaluation, and says, we have 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, but what are they among so many? I would suggest that Jesus asked them, is that all you have? You have 5,000 men beside women and children. You have 200 denarii. You have 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. What else do you have? They looked. He says, have you factored me into the equation? Bring them to me, brothers and sisters, until we get back to the business of the church and not church business. We will not be successful. It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Much has been done, but the question remains, what are we willing to do to bring into fruition when justice shall roll on like a river and righteousness like a never failing stream? So let it be us. Let it be now. God wills it so. I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Reverend Owens. Thank you for that powerful response and explicitly naming so many key issues that we must grapple with as ministers of the gospel and in service of God's people. Thank you so much. Thank you again and again. Reverend Even Melton, we know that was not your fault. We know you didn't do it. So we understand that happens sometimes with the internet and with technology. And of course, sometimes Murphy's Law is in full effect and it will happen at the most inopportune time. We're glad that you are back with us, and we will now give you the floor once again.
All right. Happy to be back. And so I want to talk a minute about how worship, how our view of scripture, how we interpret the text informs how we view worship. So all of life is worship, and that is something that clergy must continue to amplify. And as we meet on Sunday for liturgy, we must also remember that it holds value past Sunday morning. Dr. Lisa Weaver at Columbia tells us that liturgy is more than the community gathering for ritual, but it is the place where we get our vision and we fuel our imagination. It informs how we show up in the world post-Sunday. So our language around social justice in a liturgical sense really matters. We must be sure that we speak of the work of social justice as worship. And when we begin to change our language and our vision for this work during the liturgical moment, our congregations will follow suit. The people in the pews will begin to follow suit. It is Fannie Lou Hamer who gives us a glimpse of this ritual to practice type of principle when she says, you can pray until you faint, but unless you get up and try to do something, God is not going to put it in your lap. So worship as ritual, but also as practice, and it helps us connect the dots between social justice also being worship. The second thing I believe our congregations need to understand or need help understanding that we can help them know and understand the distinction between charity and social justice. There's a big distinction between charity and social justice. And so one way our institutions can immediately begin to go from ritual to practice in a way that honors social justice as worship is to change our view of community outreach, to change our view of what we think is community outreach. And in the same way that we employ a hermeneutic of suspicion to the text, we should also employ a suspicion around charitable opportunities. So, for example, the people in Flint and Uniontown, Alabama needed bottled water. They had and still have some contaminated water coming out of their faucets. If we apply a hermeneutic of suspicion to how we interpret the text, we should say, what type of lens are we viewing the text that allows us to ignore Flint and Uniontown in our preaching, right? In the same way, if we employ a suspicion to our outreach programs, while we must respond to charity action, we must take action around charity, we can also be suspicious and go beneath the surface and to find the systems and the structures that are causing the need for water in the first place. We can be suspicious and ask, how do surrounding counties, cities, and states have access to clean water, but Flint and Uniontown's water is contaminated? Last I checked, water was free. So how are these distinct communities being impacted by having contaminated water coming through their faucets? And so we must begin to ask questions about the privatization of clean water. And so if we employ this suspicion, it can take us from just being charity to actually being social justice. And we need to help our institutions understand the difference between the both of them. And so we can show up and begin to put and implement strategies that allow us to meet the immediate need, but to also do root cause analysis and also heal what needs to be healed so that our people are not as impacted. And so a lot of people question, so what's the difference between charity and social justice? The best way I've ever heard it given to me is that if you show up and there's a river and people are telling you their babies falling in the river and they need your help to get these babies out of the river, by all means, you want to get the babies out of the river. We want to get them and grab them and get them to safety. But a suspicious mindset says, let's go upstream and see what is causing the babies to fall into the rivers. And so that's how we must begin to go below the surface. We can't stay at surface level anymore. And like I said, it's like we're going to stop the bleeding, but social justice involves root cause analysis and stopping the infliction on our people and healing the system. So social justice is heavy work, but when we view it as worship, when we understand that it is also worship, we can help the people move in a better direction.
Thank you, Reverend Melton. Thank you so much for reminding us that it's important to have a hermeneutics of suspicion. And indeed, we know that many of those freedom fighters that Reverend Bentley named had exactly that angle when they looked at their society and at the religious practices around them. And we definitely must move past this surface understanding of what's going on. Reverend Womack, you were blessed with the last name that begins with W. And so you have the honor of being our last respondent on the panel. Again, Reverend Womack is the founder and the CEO of Womack Consulting. She has also started hashtag Rethinking Church Strategies, LLC. They had their first conference. She ran an excellent Rethinking Church Strategies conference last June, and she is planning to present another one in June, about a month from now. So we thank you for your presence with us. Reverend Womack, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I am humbled to be here amongst these great minds talking about an issue as important as Christian education and social justice. I have a slightly different perspective to address this from. I have a 15-year-old son, and yesterday we went to lunch and I was asking him about his involvement in church and how he sees his participation in church in the future. And Dr. Bentley mentioned that the church is not dying, it's transforming. But in some instances, I am wondering if that is actually the truth. When we look at our young people and how they choose to engage with the church and how they're engaging in social justice, I'm very concerned. I'm concerned that they don't see the value in the church and its position in social justice, because as he was stating, we're not doing a very good job of pointing them toward the guides who can help them to see that can help them to see social justice through the lens of the text. A lot of our emphasis in churches has been on the production of a Sunday morning experience. We do not place as much emphasis on how do we help people to live their lives Monday through Saturday. This generation that is before us grew up seeing Trayvon Martin, seeing Tamir Rice, seeing young Black men and women killed, modern day lynchings on social media. That has become their reality. And in many of our churches, we are not speaking to that reality. We talk about the great theologians and the liberation of theology, but we're not teaching them what does that actually mean and how do they advocate for justice. Instead, they're having to go outside of the church to find ways to get involved in community activities, to find ways to protest, because we either want to take the main stage or we tell them to just sit back and, pray about it. Everything is going to be okay. But we're not giving them ways to be actively involved through the church in issues that are very important to them. A lot of young people are concerned about environmental justice. Many of our churches are not preaching about environmental justice. They're not preaching about climate change. We're not talking to them about the issues that will affect their future. And we wonder why they're disengaged. We say that they're lazy, that they don't want to be involved. When the truth is, when you talk to them, their thing is, I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. But when I look at the church is not modeling for me those beliefs. The church is not being who I expect the church to be. So my challenge is, how do we truly make the connection? If this is the work that we want to engage in, how are we making the connection between a Christian education, the reading and the teachings with the work that we're actually doing? Are we truly focused on teaching the next generation how to be advocates? Are we teaching them how to become the guides that we read about and we preach about from our history? Are we looking to the future to prepare the next generation to continue to do this work? One of the issues, I don't know if you guys are on Twitter, but Mike Pence was tweeting this morning and he was talking about, the critical race theory. So a lot of people know that, the 1619 Project was something that was being propelled forward in order to teach the true history of the world. And then our previous president wanted to bring in this new teaching around critical race theory, which essentially minimizes the impact that people of color have had on the history of this world. I believe that if we're truly going to engage in this work, and if we're going to talk about the root of white nationalism and how we got to where we are, we have to be advocates of teaching our children, of teaching this generation and the next generation the true history of the world. White nationalism will never be eradicated as long as our students are learning in schools from the elementary all the way to high school that people of color played essentially no role in the building of this country. If we truly want to eradicate white nationalism, we have to stop teaching white people and people of color that white people were the founding fathers of this country, that they were the beginning and the end of everything that we have today. We have to stop looking at the Band-Aid, as I think Reverend Owens was saying, the Band-Aids on cancer, and really get to the root of the issues. What are we teaching, not only in the church, but what are we also teaching in school to our young people? Because that is shaping their minds about the future of the world. I also believe that we need to become better advocates for the changes that we want to see. I think that protesting is great, but how many of our church leaders are going to city council meetings, are going to county commission meetings? Where are we in the legislation of our communities? Our communities are not only being gentrified by white people, but a lot of our communities are changing with other communities of color. What are we doing to engage those communities who also have struggles? Struggles are not just limited to Black people, but there are other communities who are facing struggles, whether it's our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters. Where are we, if we're truly going to talk about liberation for all, where are we on bringing together those communities to say we all have a common struggle? How do we make an impact in our communities on those struggles? So I'm really excited to engage in this conversation. And my lens, I think, for this conversation is, what are we doing looking toward the future? What are we doing to engage the next generation in this work? How do we, if we truly believe that the church is not dying, but is transforming, what impact are we having on that transformation outside of these conversations?
Thank you so much, Dr. Womack. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of discipleship in terms of how we implement these ideas, how we engage our young people. You're absolutely right that we need to rethink education from K through 12 on, as well as college, in terms of how we understand the history of our nation. I must say, you all are on fire this morning. This is just a wonderful conversation. Everyone is on point. You all have touched so many important points. So I want to start with something that Dr. Ward put in the chat. I'm not just privileging Dr. Ward because she's Dr. Ward. She is our president, and this conversation is happening because of her. But she said, she asked a question that's very relevant and something that we all talk about ourselves as pastors. She asked, how do we get pastors to collaborate on social justice strategies and implementation? How do we try to bring our ministers together? I think Reverend Womack talked about a lot of times ministers and others want to be out front. So how do we get organization? How do we organize? Many of us have engaged in various organizations and have led various organizations in our community. So I just want to open up the floor to our panelists and to Reverend Bentley for you all to engage this question of how do we get our pastors to organize around these issues and to address implementation for these issues.
What immediately comes to my mind is a passage of scripture where James and John come to Jesus and ask for the best seats in the house. And the rest of their fellow disciples, they get upset. And I think they get upset because they thought James and John was going to beat them to something that they wanted to keep. And Jesus basically tells them, y'all got this thing twisted. This is not about a special seat. This is not about a privileged position. This is about service. This is about offering yourself to a cause that is greater than yourself. And I think that's a challenge, even and especially in the church, that too often we aspire to privilege and position rather than service. So, I believe, like Nike, which I think has the greatest slogan in the history of slogans, just do it, that you have to begin to model this new way of service. Because if we're going to wait until we start thinking differently, we'll never do anything. You got to start doing it. And if you do it long enough, your thinking will start to conform to your vision. So I don't think there's any one way to do it, but I think that's the challenge that we face of shifting from a focus on power and position and title to one of service.
Thank you, Reverend Bentley. And I don't know, there was a little problem with your sound. I don't know if you may not need the what you have plugged in. So just there was a little static in your sound there.
Is it okay? Let me see that.
Yeah, you
take it out and
okay. All right, yeah, let's
No, we can't hear him at all now.
okay, yeah, he I think Mr. Davidson muted him for a second.
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's better.
Yeah,
Okay,
perfect.
gotcha. All right.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, and you mentioned Micah 6:8, and you mentioned the importance of putting egos and agendas aside for the sake of service.
Yeah,
And
right.
obviously, and this is something internal. We just have a lot of us as pastors preach about right attitude and right action, but we often don't hold that mirror up to ourselves when we have to work with other pastors and other ministries. So this is something we definitely must address ourselves as leaders among ourselves. Other thoughts on this issue of collaboration and implementation, Reverend Melton and then Dr. Gardner?
Yes, I'd like to say that, we have to learn that if we're going to, especially issues that are impacting certain communities like Northern Birmingham, Uniontown, many times the people that are in that community are the people that we really need to be organizing with. And so that calls for us to get involved with grassroots organizing. And before we kind of connect to some of these larger organizations or sometimes the white organizations that are working with those communities, we need to make sure we're interacting with that community, which means that sometimes we have to take a back seat, right? So there may be a pastor in Uniontown that's more closer to what's happening with the environmental injustice issues in Uniontown that I may need to collaborate with because I'm way in Birmingham, Alabama, right? My father's in Perry County. He can do that work there quicker than I can. So we have to take a back seat and realize our name, our church's name may not be involved, but at the end of the day, that is an issue in our back door that we may be able to help with, even if that's with resources, but making sure our communities around us, and even in Alabama, thinking about the Black Belt, the resources are different there. And so how do we funnel resources there and be okay with removing our name and our ministry name and being in the body of Christ?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Melton. Dr. Gardner?
Yeah, a couple of things around that issue, and I think it's such a great question. One thing we must always remember that historically, it's always been a remnant. So when we look at Dr. King, and we like to think that every church of most Black churches were in line, but we have to remember that Dr. King and his father, Gardner C. Taylor, left the National Baptist Convention, which was the largest and still is the largest denomination of Black folk in the world, because of the accommodationist policies of J.H. Jackson. So when the Progressive National Baptist Convention was started, this was a remnant of churches. It's been said that only about 12% of the churches, Black churches in America, was behind Dr. King. So in the words of E.B. Hilliard, we have to go with the goers. So even though there's just a few of us, we have to do that instead of waiting on the big churches, which really they are so into conventioning and churching that they are not in the street. They are not, as Reverend Womack said, they are not at city council meetings, right? They don't have their pulse on what's going on in the cities. Secondly, and in akin to that, we have to repartner. Many times, there's probably the most damaging word, and I hate to say this, to the church has been racial reconciliation. Because what has happened, the white churches have prioritized that agenda. They have designed what that looks like. And so when we do things for the purpose of racial reconciliation, we never get to the justice issues in our community because, again, their hermeneutic does not lead to leveraging the gospel on the marginalized and those, as Howard Thurman would suggest, the disinherited. So, and I hate to say this, that so many Black pastors, they get so excited when they can partner with a white church to the end that we compromise the masses of people. And so we keep things in this kind of churchy way. And then last, Kelly Miller Smith, my research subject, he was a practitioner. He trained the great John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis. But listen to this. This kind of push for pastors to get involved, as Dr. Warwick's question is, that came from the pews. It came from the pews. As Grandmama, Big Mama said, what else gonna do? What else gonna do about this? And so when pastors give ear to that, we will have those pastors, although in the remnant, willing to partner with the people who are for the people to change the community. That's how that sort of collaboration and organization happens.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Thank you so much. Every time you said, I hate to say it, we know something's coming. Thank you so much. Reverend Owens, did I see your hand? Unmute yourself, Reverend Owens.
This Zoom and this is getting to be too much. I'll tell you what. One of the things that I'm convinced of now is that we as ministers, as preachers, have become the end all of our work. The ministry has become about us rather than about our mission. I said to a group of our pastors, and hear me before you kind of go off on it. The pandemic has caused us to do a lot of things differently, and one would be the delivering of sermons and devotionals and things of that like over electronic format. What I've noticed is that so many of my brothers, and I've said it to them, rather than mentioning the church, it's them and their ministry. They no longer ask you to give to the church. They put their cash app there. How is it that we have neglected to understand that we are co-laborers with God, that we don't own this? When we understand who we're working for, and that we're not in charge of assignment, that we are assigned, we don't have an ego problem. We don't have to sit there and think about who will get the credit and who will have the limelight, but it's meeting the need. Luke 4 again says that the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has assigned me. We're on assignment. And he who is assigned works according to the assignment without the liberty of questioning the assigner.
That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Owens. And you're right. And this goes back to Reverend Womack's point that so often we spend so much energy in just producing Sunday that we don't get out in the streets. We don't know. People drive into our churches, but they don't really know anybody around our churches.
Right.
This is such an important point and such a fundamental point. I want to go back to something that was implied. I think Dr. Gardner touched on it in his response. And of course, we are appreciative of the diversity, both in gender and in denomination, of our panel. And this is something I think Sayanda Casey mentioned earlier. And this is something that Dr. Gardner has helped lead in Tuscaloosa. This is something I addressed at a breakfast, the SCLC breakfast a couple years ago. And this is the issue of, we talk about liberation, but here we are in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and we're still struggling to liberate women in ministry. Unfortunately, outside the Methodist Church, I think we are hard pressed to find a woman as a pastor in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We're hard pressed to find a woman who's ordained in ministry in the Baptist Church, besides our sister Lizzie, who was ordained by Reverend Dr. Gardner. So, liberation has to begin at home and in our own pews. And so this even relates, of course, to Dr. Warwick's point. We need pastors to collaborate, and this goes back to all of you all's point on biblical interpretation for liberation and hermeneutics of suspicion. All of these things are interrelated. We need to start with liberating gender in our churches. We still think it's just supposed to be a man. I know none of us here think that, but it's still too pervasive in our communities. So I know you all have the answers on how to liberate our pastors on this issue. How do we, because honestly, we can't talk about, we can't have men talking about liberation and then we don't believe in the full equality of women in our churches. We can't talk about we can't go outside our church talking about anything if we don't believe women's supposed to be up there equal with a man in the pulpit. You know, not just in the kitchen, not just serving. We know women do 75% of the work in the church in the first place. So how do we help our churches start at home with this issue of liberating our views on men and women? Dr. Gardner?
Yes, and I'll be brief. I think it goes back to learning. We have to first help pastors to see that there's a way to read the Bible that has led to us oppressing women. And even if one does not arrive at a hermeneutic where we see the imago Dei in every human being, I don't even know how you espouse the image of God in every creation and subjugate women. I don't even know how you get there. I don't even know how you read Paul and really arrive at a hermeneutic where women are not active and leading in the churches, right? So the same Paul that said that women ought to privilege a man before they speak, which is badly taken out of context, is also the same Paul who said, women, when you preach, there are certain dress that you have to wear. So I think going back to helping pastors with just simple Christian education, one of the things we're appreciative at Stillman is that we offer that, not just in our religion and theology department, but we formulated a certificate in theology program where preachers who are not even interested or who cannot do the bachelor's work can come and engage in classes with credentialed professors, Dr. Ngong, Chanula, myself, Dr. Bass, and others, yourself, to sort of reimagine a hermeneutic that has led to the suppression of the very people who are doing the bulk of the work. And when we see women alongside and in front, we will see some of the organization that Dr. Ward was talking about.
Absolutely. I have some thoughts, but other thoughts and comments, Reverend Melton?
I just want to say, just speaking from a woman's perspective, I encourage the women who are listening to look around, who is mostly in your congregation, and what type of principle have you accepted that all congregations, the majority of congregations look that way, that you're doing the brunt of the work, but there's men in leadership and men making the decision. And so I caution women as well to wonder, how did you begin to accept this patriarchy, and how have you seen it? And it is okay to question it and to look and see and begin to build things that are equitable for other women. So I do want to just challenge women as well to look around and see why you have accepted such type of leadership.
Yes, absolutely. Reverend Womack.
I think from the issue of women in leadership and women in position in church, as well as the social justice issue, we have to be honest about why our church exists. Many of our churches do not exist for the liberation of all people. They exist to uphold systems of oppression, and that's why they're not able to liberate people. If your church is oppressing any group of people, whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's women, whether it's other minority groups, then you cannot then liberate people. If you are upholding a system of oppression, how do you liberate people? If you are in a prison, how do you liberate prisoners? And so I think that churches need to be honest. Why do we exist? Do we exist for Facebook? Do we exist to have press conferences when it's convenient, when tragedy strikes our community? Or do we truly exist because we believe in the liberation of all people, full stop? There cannot be a condition on who should be liberated. We should fight every single day to make sure that every person has the ability to worship in spirit and in truth. And if we're not in that business, then there's always going to be oppression. And the great thing about the United States of America is there's a church on every corner. And if your church is not engaged in the work that is important to you, that speaks to your spirit, find another church. Like, stop being a part of, stop feeding into communities that exist to oppress you.
That's good stuff.
Thank you, Reverend Womack. And all of this is, all of our points, all of you all's points are interrelated, because I think back to Reverend Bentley talking about literalism and fundamentalism and nationalism, and the issue of hermeneutics and the voices of women that Dr. Gardner mentioned. Reverend Melton mentioned hermeneutics. Reverend Womack mentioned this issue of engagement and not just having church. And I remember, I taught a night class once that was predominantly African-American, men and women. And I asked them about the passage in the New Testament where it says, slaves, obey your masters. And I asked them how they interpreted that. I asked them to imagine being in Alabama in 1850, and the Underground Railroad is coming through, but somebody was saying, quoting, slaves, obey your masters. Almost unanimously, the adult students in the class said that they understood that as not something that prevented them from seeking freedom as an American slave. They did not interpret that verse in the New Testament as saying that they had to stay in slavery. Almost across the board, men and women saw this verse in the Bible, slaves, obey your masters, and it said, no, when the Freedom Riders come, when the Underground Railroad's coming through, I'm out. I'm looking for the moss on the north side of the tree. I'm headed out. I'm looking for the North Star. I'm running for liberation. Then I took them to same class now. I took them to 1 Timothy chapter 2, where you have this controversial passage about women should not teach and have authority. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Asked the same class. Same folk. 2 minutes ago, they were all liberation theologians. They were all running away for freedom.
Right.
Then I asked them about 1 Timothy 2, and almost to a T, the women interpreted 1 Timothy very much the way they interpreted the passage about slavery, but the men were kind of inconsistent. They were like, well, I think that might still apply. And so this goes back to this issue that we're not consistent in our hermeneutics. We're not consistent in our interpretation of Scripture. We interpret Scripture one way when we see our liberation as men, but then when we get to another passage and it might have to deal with somebody else, men, gay and lesbian people, whatever the case may be. So we're not consistent. If you're going to read the passages about slavery and see them in a complicated, complex way, and not just in a straightforward way that applied to slaves, to black slaves in America, then you need to rethink how you interpret a passage about women in ministry. You need to rethink how you understand some of these passages about sexuality. Again, you may have your understanding of it, but at least be conscientiously consistent. And if your interpretation is always serving you, you ought to rethink it. If your interpretation means you're free, but then all of a sudden other folk are not free, then you really need to re-examine your conscience and your heart in your interpretation. Any other we can talk about that for the next 25 minutes. Any other comments on that? Yes, Reverend Melton. Yes. Reverend Owens, I'm sorry.
Okay. I want to approach it from another way. One of the things that we fail to understand, as I go back to my previous message, is that we are not in charge of assignments. So when you read Acts chapter 5, there's the discussion about whether or not Peter and John had any business preaching. They had been informed, they had been commanded not to preach anymore in that name. And when asked, they said, we got to obey God. But the religious leaders had problems with that. But Gamaliel says, here's what's most important as we look at it. being true to what God has placed on you. If we fight them and God has ordained them, then we find ourselves fighting against God. And if we're fighting against God, we put ourselves in a no-win situation. And so at this moment, the assignment is not ours. You know, by pure, by the truth of the matter, none of us deserve to be preachers. But it's through his grace and mercy.
Yes,
what
sir.
applies for me applies for any others.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And that's where we have to hang our head. If this is of God, we can't stop it.
Right.
Yes, sir.
And we actually find ourselves fighting against God.
That's right.
That's good. That's good. That's good.
You know this.
Go ahead.
Oh, this question reminds me of my first teaching job was in Lowndes County at Fort Deposit, Lowndes County Middle School, and we had a PTA meeting one time, and this little girl came in and she walked around this woman, and she walked around and looked at the back of her head. She said, "Baby, what you doing?" She said, "I'm looking for your other face." I said, "What you talking about?" "My mama told me you were two-faced." That's the issue of integrity. You see, too often in ministry, we have too many two-faced preachers. We're one way over here, another way over there. You remember when Peter ate with the uncircumcised, but when the circumcised came around, he pulled away from them. And Paul said, "What's up with that?" You know, too often we'll talk big in one place, but then we'll do something over here. See, I know there are certain churches I'm not going to get invited to, certain spaces I'm not going to get invited to, and I'm perfectly okay with that because I affirm the worth and dignity of all of our people.
That's right.
That's a non-negotiable.
That's right.
Right? So we have to stop doing things for likes. We know people. We're in that context. People will applaud it. We have to operate with integrity. From the word integer, to be one. What you see here is what you see there. So the issue is really one of basic integrity,
right?
You know, and be willing to pay the price for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Bentley. Thank you all for your responses to that. And to Reverend Owens' point, I think the story of Jarena Lee is that you know, she was told that she couldn't preach,
right?
And then she preached. And
right, they're going to preach.
And, you know, Reverend Richard Allen said he changed his position.
He did.
After he heard her preach. So this goes back to the point that you know, if it's of God, you'll see it, and the Spirit will bear witness to it,
right.
And we'll know that to be the case. Let's touch on this issue of engaging with policy and politicians. You know, and this goes back to this issue of collaboration and implementation, because we often, when we want to address policy, we have to address policy makers. And those policy makers are our elected politicians. And just as it's sometimes difficult to collaborate and work with pastors, sometimes it's difficult to collaborate and work with politicians. And this also gets tied into our collaboration with pastors because we always want to be respectful. We always want to be kind. We always want to be loving. We don't want to be presumptuous. So we want to have good relationships with politicians and elected officials. Yet we also find ourselves often in positions where we have to challenge them, sometimes gently, sometimes more firmly, sometimes in public, sometimes in private. But this is often a difficult issue. And this goes back to integrity and not being two-faced, Reverend Bentley. But this goes back to this issue of how do we engage politicians in a way, you know, Jesus said, be wise as a serpent, but be harmless as a dove. And we have to find this balance between sometimes a gentle approach, sometimes a confrontational approach. So based on your experience and based on your engagement with various issues, what words of wisdom would you share about this challenge and this difficulty of engaging politicians and sometimes pressing them on particular policy issues?
I want to share a personal. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I
want to share a personal example. I just served on an advisory committee of the Huntsville City Council that was appointed to investigate two incidents that happened in the wake of George Floyd's murder last year. We were appointed, and along with an independent counsel out of Birmingham, to investigate these incidents and to make a report to the city council. Now, of course, there was pressure to, paint the police in a positive light, and I just let them know from the jump. Look, I'm not here to be anti-police or pro-police. We're here to get at the truth. And if I feel like that's not what we're doing, count me out. I'm off this committee. So we just finished up and made our report to the city council, 250-page report. And just a few things. There was a begrudging cooperation from the Huntsville city police chief, and no cooperation from the Madison County Sheriff's Office. And the long and short of it is that report does not paint them in a good light. But it was not about setting out to be anti-police or pro-police. It was about, let's get at the truth of what happened. And we poured over hundreds of hours of video, had all kinds of citizens to come in and give testimony and to go on the record. And that's what we based our report on. So that it goes back to the issue of integrity. You can't start out with a preconceived notion of we're going to do this because we want to have a certain outcome. You go where the evidence leads you, and then that's what you present.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Bentley. Thank you so much. Reverend Womack?
I believe that the Black church has been hoodwinked by this notion of separation of church and state, while white churches stand on the principles of conservative Christian values. I think that notion has caused us to not be involved in politics because we believe that we can't organize, we can't get involved because we might lose our 501c3 status, when there are ways that we can organized in our communities. About 10 years ago, there was a young man in Georgia that was about to be electrocuted. And I remember people were on social media going crazy, stop the execution. And it dawned on me that we have no political power because we don't support political candidates. The first time someone says something negative about a Black candidate, we are on the bandwagon to throw them under the bus and drive the bus right over them, while you have other parties who will have a pedophile on the ballot. They will support them. They will almost elect them because they know that if they get that person in office, they're going to do their bidding. I think that we need to do a better job of getting people in office who are going to support our values and make it known that we help to get you elected. And we have an expectation that if you say you represent our values, that your votes are going to align with that. When you look at the United States Congress, the United States Senate, state representatives, state senates, you do not see a large representation of Black Christian leaders in those spaces. It's not because we don't have the votes, but it's because we don't support, we don't contribute to campaigns, we don't donate, and then we wonder why the policies do not reflect our values. If we truly want to see a change, it has to happen with policy. And we don't do a good job of supporting policymakers and holding them accountable to ensuring that our issues are not only heard, but they're also being voted on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Womack. And that reminds me, too, that often, to your point about understanding the laws and this issue of church and state, we as pastors can address issues. We can address policy issues. Now, we cannot, in our role as pastors, endorse a politician, endorse someone running for office, but we can address issues. We can talk about police brutality. We can talk about clean water. We can talk about education. We can talk about a whole host of things. We can address issues. And then we know our people are smart enough to understand, okay, if this is where this issue is, they can figure out who best represents that issue in terms of who is running for office. So we do need to be clear that there is nothing prohibiting us as pastors in our churches from addressing issues, nothing at all. We just have to be careful about the issue of endorsement with particular candidates. So thank you, Reverend Womack, for reminding us of that. Reverend Melton?
And I was going to make that same point, that we deal with issues so that we stay in a position so that when it is time to speak truth to power, someone who has gotten elected that we may have supported, that we can hold their feet to the fire as well. What I'm finding in Birmingham, we have a lot of pastors that are on commercials for politicians when they're running. And to me, that's an overstep, because you're leading your people in favor of a person. But at the end of the day, you may have to challenge that person once they get into office. And so we must remember what our role is, because the day that you do step out and challenge an elected official, the larger community may not support you. So you're putting yourself on the line, and we must understand our role and our assignment. And that way we stay free to speak freely and stick with issues.
Dr. Scribner?
Yes, sir.
I think the other thing I really want to say in conjunction with Dr. Bentley is that as in regards to these positions, they have to be platform driven rather than personality driven. Because when we align ourselves based on personalities, as Reverend Melton said, at some point there's going to be something that we've got to speak to. And if we've sold our soul to the devil, you know, what's the old song? If you dance to the music, got to pay the piper. We lose our voice. We lose our ability to object. And so we've got to be principle and platform driven to know and have our congregation know that when we speak about an issue, we are informed and we're giving them the best knowledge that we have, and that we have not been bought, we have not been co-opted. We are speaking the truth.
Absolutely. And let's relate this to our students. Dr. Warwick has a question related to how do we help students in the college? Sometimes, you know, and we saw this as we tried to encourage students to vote. Many of them became voting age eligible for the first time when they're in college. And sometimes they feel like policy issues don't affect them. They say, you know, they're all the same. Politicians are all the same. My voting doesn't count. My voting doesn't matter. How do we engage students in a college context, in an undergraduate context? Of course, we can do it earlier as well, but especially in the context that we serve in at Stillman College, what recommendations, suggestions, or ideas would you have in terms of engaging our students on these issues, and so they can see the relevance of their own engagement as citizens? Dr. Gardner?
Yes, I think that there must be a collaboration between academics and student activities. So the folk who teach, our professors, in terms of curriculum design, must also engage dean of students, vice presidents of student affairs, and collaborate on these issues. So we get theory in the classroom, but how do we practice that on the campus and beyond? So I think this marriage of departments of academics and also student affairs and student engagement is what we need. How can we overcome that fear? Public speaking is always one of the monsters in the room, right? I think creating these platforms where on campus, within sororities, fraternities, where students are developed to give this sort of accurate articulation of what they learn in the classroom. So providing these platforms of leadership development through departments of academics and also student affairs, I think is how we get there. And we get them to engage policy in that way.
Absolutely. Yes, Reverend Bentley.
All right, I pulled one of your numbers, Dr. Owens.
I'm glad to see it, brother.
I'm in the number. I think, you know, all politics starts with the personal. What's important to young folk? What's important to students? Are they concerned about financial aid? Are they concerned about student loans? Are they concerned about debt forgiveness? Start there. Start with what's important to people, because when we talk about how these things come about, this is a political process that will bring or not bring that about. So you start with what's important to people. It can't be some ephemeral type of thing, esoteric type of thing. Start with the Howard Thurman says at the ashtray level, what's important to them, and build around that. And I think we can get some traction. Not just, we can't, often, too often we say, oh, what your ancestors did this, and all that's true, but that's not going to move people to get involved and to stay involved. You have to make it personal. You have to meet people where they at the point of felt need.
Absolutely. Reverend Womack, yes.
I just want to add that representation matters. And I think that a lot of times we have failed to expose our young people to local politics. And when they are not aware of how local politics affects their everyday lives, then it is easy to become disconnected. I've worked on political campaigns at pretty much every level, and it is disheartening to see the lack of African American or Black people who are involved in campaigns, whether it's as an organizer, if it's as a campaign manager. There are so many ways that our young people can get involved in politics outside of being the candidate that will allow them to be exposed. And the thing about young people is they're social. So if they're involved, they're going to tell their friends and it's going to spread. But I don't think that we do a good job of giving them representation so that they can see how they can be a part of the process. And it does become more theoretical, because if we're only focused on the presidential elections, if we're only focused on these high level elections, then they don't see how it involves or how it impacts them. But when you start talking to them about, okay, this is what your mayor is responsible for, this is what the police chief is responsible for. Like when people were going after Kamala Harris about her record as an attorney general, my question was, well, who's your attorney general? Do you know what their record is? Most people are not aware of the role that their local politicians play. But when you expose them to that information, then they're like, hold up, wait a minute, let me start paying more attention. And so I think that we have to make sure that they see people like them who are in these positions, so then they can see that they too can be in these positions. But then we also have to expose them to the roles of different politicians and how they impact their lives. And then they will get involved, I believe.
Absolutely. I think this issue of exposure, and this is something we try to do at the college, also with our chapel services and with our religious emphasis series, we try to have a variety of speakers from various positions in terms of men and women and age, so that they will see various examples, and then their minds are opened up for the possibilities of what they can do. We had Reverend Eva Melton do a religious emphasis series for us, not just this week, but a couple of years ago. And at least one of our students drove from Tuscaloosa to Birmingham to worship with Reverend Melton. So she was excited about seeing Reverend Melton at the college, and they developed a relationship. And that was possible because we facilitated exposure to something beyond what they've always seen, or something beyond the typical male preacher, so forth and so on. So we need to make them aware of these various possibilities. The last question I want to highlight is something we got from a LinkedIn user.
Dr. Scribner.
Yes.
Before you go to that question, I want to say a word about what Reverend Womack just said about politics, very briefly. Not only is all politics personal, all politics is local. Local politicians exercise a tremendous amount of influence over our quality of life.
Right.
When you look at city councils, school board members, county commissioners, they wield a great deal of power over how your local reality is shaped. So, we get all excited about the presidential election, which we should, because that's important. But we often miss the stuff that is happening locally that kind of has a greater impact on how we live day to day. I tell you what, let your trash not get picked up. You get what I'm saying? We don't think about that type of stuff. Or here with Huntsville Utilities, something goes wrong with the grid and the power is down, not for a week, but just a day. And you see how that impacts your life. So yeah, you're right, Reverend Womack. We really do have to have a greater sense of how politics works right around us.
Right, absolutely. And Dr. Warwick is reminding us, and this is something Dr. Gardner, Dr. Womack, Dr. McCormick, and I will work on, in terms of integrating this into the curriculum. And this reminds us into the curriculum at Stillman College. And this reminds me to mention again that this is the first of many of these conversations. We are looking at how we can develop curriculum emphases at the college and how we can engage these kinds of conversations, both in the classroom, in student activities, and then in the community. So I'm delighted that this has been a wonderful first event, and we want to continue to discuss this. And we'll talk about implementation, both in terms of curriculum. How do you develop nonprofit organizations? How do you fund them? How do you organize them? All of those things are things we need to talk about, both within the classroom with our students and in the community. The last thing I want to mention is something a LinkedIn user brought up, and it's an appropriate point to end on. The LinkedIn user asked, where do you find joy in your work? And to Reverend Bentley, you know, we have to make sure people have a sense of calling, and you all address this. You have to have a sense of calling to this work before you try to figure out how to implement it, because the implementation will burn you out and you'll be discouraged and quit if you don't feel that calling from God, that sense of vocation in your life, that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So as a final point, would each of you just address briefly your sense of calling and your sense of joy that sustains you in the midst of this work?
You know, there's a story about a seminarian going out to the desert to visit one of the desert fathers, and he's a monk. He was living a monastic life, and this seminarian asked the old man. He says, "You know, Father, how have you been able to sustain this journey for all this time? Many have come after you, but they couldn't hack it. They left. They couldn't stay the course." And the old man was sitting there with his dog, and he said, "One day a rabbit ran by my house, and my dog saw the rabbit and began to chase and bark at the rabbit. And sure enough, other dogs began to bark and chase, and they went up and down ravines all through hollow logs. But see, eventually the other dogs gave up the chase and went back to basking in the sun or doing whatever they were doing. He says, only my dog continued to bark and chase the rabbit." And the seminarian is like, "Well, I don't get it. Well, what's that all about?" He said, "My dog was the only one that saw the rabbit. If you don't see what you're going after, this journey becomes too difficult. It becomes too much of a burden. We got to see what we're going after. Will we get disappointed? Yes. Will we have times we want to give up? Yes. But when you see what you're going after," Paul says, "I press forward toward the mark of the higher calling of Christ Jesus." And joy is not found at the end of the journey. Joy is found along the way. It's found. I feel joy right now just being with this august panel of people, right? Joy is found in being with people like mine, knowing that y'all are pulling for the same thing. I'm reminded of something Joe Montana said. They asked him when he retired, they said, "Joe, what do you miss most about playing?" He said, you know, they thought he was going to say, well, the rings and the championships and the money and all that. He said, "You know what I miss most? What I miss most is that feeling of having 11 men on the same page, pulling for the same thing." See, I miss that. There's something about real fellowship, real koinonia, when you're with a group of people that are pulling for the same thing and going after the same thing. That's a joy unlike any other.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Bentley. Absolutely. Others, please chime in.
I get joy out of just knowing that this is a communal work. And while I may hold a vision and I get to meet with other visionaries, that I sit in a position to be able to help people understand how they fit. You know, there's so many avenues into social justice, helping people to understand those avenues, but helping them see how they can fit. And that collaboration for me is what provides a lot of the energy. If we stay focused on the task and the reason that God brought us together to do this work, then that collaboration itself energizes me.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Others? Dr. Gardner?
Yes, I think being consumed by the call, something Dr. Owens said a few minutes ago, and that is none of us are qualified to be where we are. I know where I came from, and that on the backwoods of Pickens County. I'm not supposed to be here, but it was only by the grace of God and people that I'm here today. And what motivates me and what gives me joy is the people, to know that there's someone out there that will not have agency and access unless I act and advocate on their behalf, just like somebody did for me. So that's the joy that propels my activism, doing it for the people and for the glory of God.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Gardner.
I will, what gives me joy really is the understanding that I'm walking in my purpose. I'm walking in my calling. Joy in spite of circumstances, in knowing that I don't walk alone. Knowing that there is a reservoir of hope and faith that I can draw from. Too many of us have these abstract destinations that we think will provide ultimate joy. And so we say, when I get here, or when I do this, or when I accomplish this, then I'll be joyful. But my joy is in the journey. I pray many prayers that never come true. I've seen them vanish at dawn, but I've received enough answers to my prayers to make me want to keep praying on. So I stumble, I fall, but God enables me to continue. Joy because of Jesus. That's why I'm all right.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Owens. Thank you so much. Reverend Womack.
I think my joy in this work comes from, as all the previous panelists said, just the community, building community. Rethinking church is different from pastoring or being a part of an actual church, because we're a social impact community and we're attempting to do something that is not really being done, and that's bringing together people from different faith communities to take a critical look at the church and to have hard conversations about what needs to be done to create a church that our children and our grandchildren will want to be a part of. And it's hard because there are so many people who have this mindset of, well, the people should just come to us. And if we just keep holding on, then, they're going to come back. And, the church has, been here for hundreds of years, so it's still going to be here. But, we have to find people who want to say no, like, let's challenge that. Let's really look at what do we need to do to be different. And initially, I didn't believe that there was a large community of people who wanted to engage in that conversation. But seeing people who are willing to think critically of the church, not because we have disdain for the church, but because of our love for the church and because of our love for community and our love for our children and our grandchildren, and to want to sit with these tough topics, like that brings me joy to know that the church does have a future because we are willing to have these tough conversations.
Amen.
Absolutely. Again, I am just delighted that we've had this conversation today. I remind our audience that this is the first of many. So I've been watching the comments, and we can't get to everything. And to Brother James Muhammad, we will have students in future panels. Again, and I sometimes less is more. And so we have to zoom in on a particular issue with a particular group of people, understanding that this is the first of many conversations, because if you try to address everything, you end up saying nothing. So we want to talk first today about the basic issue of social justice in the gospel. And I'm a firm believer that people must first have a sense of calling. You must first have a burning, and then you will go after the learning. But if you don't have the burning, you're not going to care about the learning. You're not going to stay up late. You're not going to work hard on reading or writing. But if you have a sense that this is what God has called you to do, if you have a sense that this is something that has a higher purpose, and then you are re-energized by engagement with people, then you will continue to press on. So thank you all so much. Thank you. Panelists, I ask you to stay after Mr. Davison ends the public video. Stay around a moment just to debrief. And again, I thank each of you. Thank you, Reverend Bentley, for starting us off with your excellent keynote address. Thank you to each of you, Dr. Gardner, Reverend Melton, Reverend Owens, Reverend Womack, thank you all so much. Thank you again for Dr. Ward for initiating this event and her vision for how we might address these issues in the classroom and in the community as a college. And so we are starting this conversation. Obviously, we've been engaged in it, but we're thinking about new ways to present it and to tackle it. And so this is just the beginning. Okay, so don't hold it against us if we didn't address all of it. This is just the beginning. And, more is to come, and we will find various ways to address the issues, again, both for the classroom and in the community. So thank you all. Have a wonderful Friday afternoon. Remember, we have commencement streaming tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., and you can find access to that at stillman.edu. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. God bless you.
Bless you.